So exactly 100 years ago, 1 year after October Revolution, Soviet Russia instituted educational reform, a massive nationwide reform, reorganizing, among other things, art, architecture, and design schools. The reform made higher education free and accessible to all, privileging those of proletarian and low-income background. In order to educate this newly empowered masses, Lenin government dissolved all existing educational institutions and set up the so-called free state art studios. These were quite chaotic. Students voted for faculty that they wanted to study with. And after a couple of years of this experiment, the government decided to yet do another reform. So similarly to the Bauhaus, the studios were in fact a result of a joint merger between the Fine Art School and the Craft College, so shown here. And in that respect, they're a part of a much longer academic tradition. So Vkhutemas, and I want to start with sort of trying to decipher that term, is in fact higher art and technical studios, an acronym that's from Высшие художественно-технические мастерские, that's known as Vkhutemas, and it was conceived, and I quote, as a specialized educational institution for advanced artistic and technical training, created specifically to prepare highly qualified artist practitioners for the modern industry. So while here I focus on the Moscow Vkhutemas, in fact, that was a network that was spread across most major Russian cities. As an institution, the school evolved pretty much consistently throughout the decade of its existence. Practically every academic year witnessed a radical change in the institutional structure and curriculum. So the course of study typically took 5 years, and 2 years were occupied by basic training, followed by 2.5 years of chosen specialization, and then finally a semester for diploma project. So originally, the school consisted of 8 departments: architecture, painting, sculpture, graphics, textiles, ceramics, wood, and metalworking. But eventually, those overcame certain changes. In 1926, the studios or workshops underwent another educational reform, then was restructured and were restructured into an institute. So this is another name for Vkhutemas, is Vkhutein, which is High Art and Technical Institute. So don't get confused, I will just use the same, the one single term Vkhutemas for both phases. And this was really a way to address the emergence or the implementation of the first 5-year plan that started in 1928, and the growing need for industrial production and trying to converge the education with the needs of mass industrialization. Vkhutemas was also a school that had kind of its own, had its own diploma, with the building that the school was in featured on the diploma, and that's important because, for example, Bauhaus did not give out a certificate like that. So in 1930 and 1929, there was yet another shift, and at that point, that was the end of the school. The school was reorganized into 6 separate institutions, among them the Moscow Architectural Institute that is still in existence today, but also Fine Arts School, the Graphic Design Institute, Textile, and others. The school shutdown was part of the shift, of course, from avant-garde to socialist realism, signaled by the competition of the Palace of Soviets. The current state of knowledge on Vkhutemas remains limited and not precise. Limited due to a lack of published resources, to the language barrier, and the political confrontation between the West and Russia that lasted for decades and apparently still continues somehow. So Alfred Barr, the first director of Museum of Modern Art, visited Vkhutemas apparently 3 times during his visit to Moscow in 1927, And yet, he chose not to include the school in his very well-known diagram of modern art. He did show the suprematism and constructivism, the two major artistic avant-garde movements, and then, of course, the Bauhaus as being influenced by those movements, but yet Vkhutemas is missing. So the question that I would like to ask is why is that that the school that was, is often known as a Soviet Bauhaus and certainly was a contemporary of the German very well-known school has no place in history, even though Bar himself wrote in his diary that we feel, him and his partner with whom he traveled, Joseph Abbott, that as if we're in the most important place in the world for us to be. So this was Moscow in 1927. Would rather be here than any other place on earth. I mean, this is a very, very, very passionate statement. And yet, by 1936, there is no place for Vkhutemas in his show on Cubism and modern art. There are, however, works by the professors who taught at Vkhutemas, by Rodchenko, Lisitsky, Ginsburg, and others. So some of the shots here. But not only Vkhutemas was short-lived, only lasting a decade. Of course, its outreach was very, very narrow, we think today. Contacts with the rest of the world were few and far between, and ideological barriers were compounded by the physical ones. And yet, despite its limited legacy today, Vkhutemas was not unknown at the time at all. So not only to Bar, but I would say to the rest of the kind of design and artistic and cultural community. The single event that put the school on the map was the International Art Deco exhibition in Paris in 1925. Projects by the students and by Vkhutemas faculty won a number of prizes at the exhibition, and of course were featured in catalogs like this one of the USSR, designed by Rodchenko with projects by Vkhutemas, and put on the map the two professors who taught there, and Rodchenko and Melnikov. I would also say that the school was widely publicized in books designed by Lisitsky, like Russia, the World Revolution, and about probably half of the projects featured in this book are Vkhutemas projects, so student work. So in fact, the school counted practically the entire Russian avant-garde among its ranks. Besides Melnikov and Rodchenko, its professors counted constructivists Stepanova, Popova, Vesnin, Vladimir Tatlin, Moisei Ginsburg. Of course, Vasily Kandinsky played a seminal role in establishing the school in the first years after revolution, and of course, later in the Bauhaus. So perhaps somewhat less known were the so-called rationalists, architects Nikolay Ladovsky and his colleagues, Vladimir Krinsky and Nikolay Dokuchayev, whose work I will focus on here. And we should not forget that the school also produced some of the incredible students, Ivan Leonidov, for example, and Georgy Krutikov, projects that probably many of you have seen, and I don't know whether or not you realize that those were diploma projects done in the late 1920s. Communist doctrine operated under the assumption that human being is a blank slate, that anyone, regardless of talent, natural ability, or social status, could, through proper training, become a professional in any sphere of life. In the case of Vkhutemas student, an artist practitioner, this doctrine highlighted and heavily relied on a scientific method to bring about such transformations. So here, another idea that is actually quite important is the idea of equality also between men and women represented in Lisitsky's poster. The artistic training of hundreds of students, many of whom came from underprivileged, peasant and working class backgrounds, and often lacked basic education, was a monumental undertaking in itself. Yet its larger significance lay in creating a new social order, in which design education would serve as a key building block for fashioning the new mass society. An integral aspect of this was the creation of physical environments, the so-called social condensers that would bring together, organize, and empower the masses. And in fact, school itself served as such kind of social condenser. This is probably one of my favorite photographs of the school, with the costumes designed by Varvara Stepanova in around 1924. And an integral part of creation of this physical environment was also living and studying and working together, and sort of creating or being in this, maybe you can call an educational incubator. The quest for a mass utopia, so prominent in the Soviet culture in its early years, was central to Vkhutemas. The students' collectives, enthusiasm of the student collectives helped overcome the turmoil left by civil war, substandard living conditions, and shortages of the most basic necessities, as well as, of course, any kind of building materials or resources for making things, and yet allowing them to produce a remarkable body of work. So we have to remember that this is the school was founded while still civil war was happening, and definitely the conditions in which the students were living and working and studying were absolutely horrific. So one of the other very important parts of the Vkhutemas model was the political activity of the students, whether voluntary or mandatory. It was a very it was a school that was very actively involved in building the new society. The students were politically active. They were out in the streets. They were demonstrating. They were truly, I think, passionate, from what I can tell in my research, about the kind of larger social mission that they were part of. Vkhutemas is often compared to the Bauhaus. Both schools sought to build a democratic educational model open to everyone, and I quote, according to their abilities, and aimed at forming a working community. They nonetheless differed significantly on the matter of that community's size. So the student body at Vkhutemas was about 10 to 20 times larger than that of the Bauhaus. So in 1924-25 academic year, for example, we had about 1,445 students at Vkhutemas and about 127 at the Bauhaus. And that same, the other school that maybe was comparable in size was École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, which counted about over 1,000 students, and for example, 1,121. That also meant that the faculty body was also much, much larger. So here we have a Vkhutemas faculty dinner celebrating its, I was going to say centennial, its 10-year anniversary in 1928, the anniversary of the Free State Art Studios, and of course the famous photograph showing the Bauhaus cast of faculty on the roof. So just to give you a sense of the size, we also can look at it in this kind of scale chart with the different departments and how they lay out. That also meant that the organizational structures of the two schools were very different. So you actually had a kind of three-step structure at the Vkhutemas, and essentially like a studio-based structure at the Bauhaus. So sort of give you an idea. And I think it's very important to kind of think about this for a second, because the chief difference between Vkhutemas and the Bauhaus was not just a mere matter of enrollment. And it is perhaps best summarized by a dialogue, again, with Alfred Barr, the first director of MoMA, and the Vkhutemas professor, head of the Soviet Art Education Committee, Professor David Sternberg. So Barr had asked Sternberg what was the chief difference between the two schools, and Sternberg apparently stated that the Bauhaus aimed to develop an individual, whereas the Moscow workshops focused on developing the masses. Sternberg's comment, dismissed by Barr and others as a superficial and doctrinaire, this is, I quote, nonetheless, I think has far-reaching implications. While the Bauhaus was in fact about training an individual, whether or not as craftsman or an industrial designer, Vkhutemas was about fulfilling an ambitious political mandate to educate a working-class society. So the size of Vkhutemas on the one hand and the political agenda of building this new society on the other posed a very different set of challenges and created a need for a standardized pedagogical approach across disciplines, this method that we're going to talk about. It also meant that there was quite a serious diversity between the different faculties and the different people who taught, especially towards, I would say, the kind of the end of the decade. We're beginning to see the real split between the so-called industrial and the fine art departments. Something that was noted by a Bauhaus wall painting master, Henrik Schepper, when he showed up in Moscow in 1930. And I think one of the quotes that I would read is, you cannot paint, so he writes to the Vkhutemas students, it's an open letter, you cannot paint academic nudes and at the same time construct a chair for the masses. You're studying academic painting, but academic painting is dead. Throw away its dead corpse. In the stifled atmosphere, nothing new can be born. Wipe it off with the dust of the atelier. So it was a school that was not unified in the same way I would say that Bauhaus was. It was rather diverse, of course, also because of the size. And this kind of struggle was also experienced by another Bauhaus professor, the director of the school, Hannes Meyer, who was a successor of Gropius, who was incredibly enthusiastic in 1930, where he writes, I'm living for the USSR to work among the people who are forging a true revolutionary culture, to make a gift to socialism and revolution of all our knowledge, all our strength, and the experience that we have acquired in the art of building. And here he is in the Moscow Architectural Institute at this point, teaching. And of course, leaves completely disgruntled, asking, what can I do to contribute to the national Soviet architecture? Of course, at this point, the socialist realist style took over. For you, I'm a cold rationalist, a systematic type, so I'm useless for now. That's why I'm resigning. So by 1937, she was lucky enough to get out. While both Vkhutemas and the Bauhaus brought together all the disciplines of practical art by offering instructions in woodworking, metalworking, textiles, graphics, painting, ceramics, sculpture, and color, or in the Bauhaus, it was actually color, clay, and stone, they differed in their attitude towards the discipline of architecture. At Vkhutemas, it was envisioned on an institutional level. So here, and by the way, this is of course, a well-known diagram by Gropius from 1922, and this is a diagram that I produced just as a kind of analogous version of the Bauhaus diagram. It's not an authentic one there. So, but it allows us to compare the structure. And it was envisioned, the architecture was envisioned on institutional level as an independent department, and instruction was offered in architecture from the very beginning until diploma. And yet the schools, of course, had a lot in common. The production facilities, so one picture is of Vkhutemas, another of the Bauhaus. And also the things that were actually produced were really about changing the everyday life. So of course here we have a very well-known chair by Breuer and perhaps a less known chair by Tatlin. And in fact, the slide is really good at trying to explain the difference in terms of the resources of the two schools. So while here we have an incredible sort of metal tube structure using the, I think, Yonkers high-quality steel. In Vkhutemas, Tatlin had to use cheap bent wood, which he tied together with some rope. And yet, I think the ambition is also clear. And in some ways, the chair also performs in this kind of nice, springy way. So architecture was considered, I would say, similarly to the Bauhaus. It was envisioned as a dominant field, but it was envisioned on an institutional level. So while for Gropius at the Bauhaus, the disciplines, sculpture, painting, handicrafts, and the crafts, were regarded as, I quote, inseparable components of a new architecture that came together, and I quote, in the unified work of art, the great structure. Of course, the great structure changed throughout the decade. It was both imaginary, like this cathedral of Light by Lionel Feininger, the famous etching, and eventually sort of developing into a building that's the Bauhaus itself. So the crystal symbol of a new faith became the landmark of functional architecture. So while present in the core of the Bauhaus and articulated as building site, testing, design, building and engineering science, architecture remained, as Gropius said, a distant aim. And yet, Gropius's own architectural practice thrived side by side with his running the school and relied on student labor. The architectural curriculum at the school was not set up, in fact, until Hannes Meyer came in late 1927, early to 1928. So the one other part of the two schools that the schools share was the so-called core curriculum or basic course, and also known as the core division at the Vkhutemas. So that course, in fact, was the one unifying structure that brought together, in fact, in both schools, these different departments. And it's really sort of fundamental to the way and the whole sort of structure of the school and the school's mission and its idea as an avant-garde institution. So at Vkhutemas, the core curriculum was developed by a group of artists and architects, all of whom were members of the Institute of Artistic Culture, founded by Vasily Kandinsky in 1920. And we're talking about Alexander Rodchenko, Lyubov Popova, Alexander Vesnin, Korolev, Boris Korolev, Anton Lavinsky, of course, Nikolay Ladovsky, and his colleagues. So just a few words about this mysterious institute. It was set up with the mission to develop a science of art by Kandinsky and find the so-called objective method. And the institute functioned as a kind of research think tank of the school of Vkhutemas, and was really instrumental to sort of develop those not just courses, but in fact elements of the arts as independent, separate sort of disciplines that became or evolved as actually pedagogical directions. So the history of the course itself was also, in fact, quite dynamic. So at some point, so originally it was a quartet, so consisting of 4 courses: space, volume, color, and graphics. But it continued to kind of change throughout the decade, and eventually color was substituted by painting and graphics was substituted by drawing. Nevertheless, the preparatory course, as it was called, was considered the most important achievement of the Bauhaus by many, including Anatoly Lunacharsky, who was the head of the Commission of Enlightenment or Education. So I would argue that this core curriculum was the first venture of its kind to implement the kind of mass-accessible design education. And it combined nascent industrialized and also long-standing academic methods to initiate a new type of pedagogy, something that can be considered universal. A significant condition of this educational agenda was that the subject itself, i.e. the kind of modern art, was also in architecture, was also in the early stages of emergence. And the principal elements explored in the core curriculum, space, volume, color, plane, and line, were a priori abstract. So all of the conventions, established conventions of existing design and artistic education had to be re-examined as such. So this is one of the photographs showing the accomplishments of the core curriculum with the various courses that were, and students work from various courses. So as opposed to the classical training that required knowledge of historical canons or drawing from nature, sorry for the quality, The universal approach was explorative in nature and built around the continuous feedback between assignments and solutions. So the top-down academic or apprenticeship training was replaced in this way by a method-based instruction that relied on an active exchange between student and teachers. So this is quite important. So in this case, students were not drawing what was in front of them, but they were drawing something completely different. Vkhutemas core exercises challenged this established canons of academic tradition by replacing it with an open-ended inquiry into abstract form. And the resultant experiments were articulated into also advanced projects within the framework of the school's 8 departments. And although these 4 courses, the original core curriculum was short-lived, their impact on the interdisciplinary synthesis, as well as on the articulation of a new modern aesthetic, was really essential. So I want to go through and talk a little bit about those 4 courses, just really briefly, just so you get a sense of what was actually being done there. So the course Color was developed by Popova and Vesnin and involved exercises in relationship between color and form. The course was, in fact, kind of split between the academic painting kind of from nature and the color studies. The color studies were the ones kind of clearly scientific direction where there was, in fact, the various established color wheels and other ways to talk about color, as a science. And another, I think, important component of the course or of the discipline was a set of exercises developed by Gustav Klutzes on the relationship between color and form. So the other core course volume also had this strange kind of dichotomy where there was both the figure and the abstract composition present. And the way that worked was by kind of moving from both directions. So one set of exercises abstracted the human figure and made it into kind of this cubist sculpture, like you can see here, while the other set of exercises would take the composition using the various abstract elements and geometric figures and put them together and develop sort of another set of compositions. So we could see sort of many little exercises like that within the course. The course graphics, which was developed by Alexander Rodchenko, starting in 1920. In fact, Rodchenko was probably one of the most committed faculty at the school. He was at the school from 1920 through 1930. At some point, he headed, in fact, the core division for a year. But then he was relegated to the industrial department, metal and woodworking. So Rodchenko developed this exercise called Initiative, which is probably one of my favorite kind of exercises to teach, because it basically, anybody could do it. You don't have to have any training, and this is one of the I think the really kind of key aspects of the Vkhutemas training is that of Vkhutemas models that anybody can learn. So the way it worked is that there was a combination of kind of this trajectories or schema, and then there was a number of so-called materials or elements, and then those would have to be composed on a page. So now you think that it's easy, but how does one know what to do, maybe, but also what not to do? So Rodchenko defined a set of conditions that, in fact, were examples of what not to do. For example, you could not be too ornamental, you could not have those things small on the page, you cannot have them go outside of the limits of the page. So it was a real training in this kind of sensibility of what that new modern art was. And some of the examples of this are works by his student, Anastasia Akhterka. And by the way, women were probably, incredibly active as students and also as faculty in the school. So she developed a series of exercises doing kind of responding to this initiative prompt, like this. But also Rodchenko himself, his own work had this kind of highly didactic methodological approach, where he would do series after series after series exploring this set of different ideas. So in this case, this is called spatial constructions, and he had 3 series of this constructions based on principles of equal form, like this one is unfolded planimetric shape. So Rodchenko, in fact, was one of the, I think, most fundamental people in kind of defining the aesthetic of this new modern field and of design. And his writing, I think, is really, really powerful. So I would just read this quote: "The exclusive purpose of spatial constructions was to bind the constructor to the law of expediency of the forms used, to demonstrate universality, so that one can build out of these identical shapes all kinds of constructions for various systems, types, and applications." So, and this is interesting because this is his wife Stepanova and some of their students. And in fact, in their studio, you can see those constructions in the back. So in this, he continues, "In these works, which are real constructions, I promulgate a mandatory condition for future industrial builder. Nothing random or uncontrolled. Everything has to be reduced to universal initiative. It has to be simplified and generalized." So those were, in fact, kind of like proto-elements for beginning to build actually real objects. So the goal of design is to discipline the student to develop an understanding of contemporary requirements, conveniences of living, and technical possibilities through a concrete work on an object. So those are actually pieces of furniture that have, I think, a number of things that are very typical of that historical moment. So first of all, they're very light. Second, they're really economic in the use of material. They all are multifunctional. They, most of them are transforming, so going from, and I'll show you further, going from, let's say, like this, a table to a desk to a storage unit to a bench, or a bed that can fold out, or a bookshelf that can turn into a box and then be kind of spread out and compose a workers' club like the one in Paris, which he built. So all of those are in fact done as part of his course in metal working department at Vkhutemas. So the students, and you saw this picture before, here they're making that incredible teapot, which is actually a pot, which is actually a frying pan, which also, in fact, goes into one's backpack very nicely. And you have to remember that this is the time of people, really moving all over the country. There is a huge kind of exodus from the villages. Everybody has their backpacks. So that first photo that you saw, I mean, this is very much, I think, what the time was about. So another project by the same student who you saw doing those incredible pencil drawings, Anastasia Akhtirka, she did a lamp, and I don't know whether she actually got to build it or not, but if it was the Bauhaus, they definitely would have. But the lamp was both, and you can see here, it was for a floor lamp, but it was also a table lamp. And I think that actually could be a worthwhile project to build for sure, if now that we don't have a shortage of metal or mechanical parts. So Rodchenko's wife, as I mentioned, Varvara Stepanova, is an incredible artist in her own right. She is also many things like her husband. She is at Vkhutemas. She teaches textile design, and in fact tests the designs herself. She produces, as you can see with her dress, she produces with her students kind of the variety of different fabrics that they then print or manufacture in the various textile factories around Moscow. So Lisitsky, another very, very famous figure in Russian avant-garde, comes back from his travels in Europe in 1925 and joins the faculty. He is joining at that point a woodworking department, which he basically becomes like a kind of interior designer in what we know in the contemporary term. One of the projects that he does is the outfit of the Ginsburg's Narkomfin, so this is a real life case. And also does a number of those, types of things that we saw with Rodchenko. So he, in fact, creates a kind of 4 types of interior outfits. So there's built-in furniture, there's transformable furniture, combinatorial, and standardized. So again, they kind of fit in within the overall mission of this department. So since I'm going to not talk about the industrial design, but I will talk about architecture, this is the fourth course of the quartet, which is space, and where we'll focus on. So space, or пространство, was the only discipline in this among the four that was sustained throughout the decade, from its initial test run in the early 20s to its rollout the following year in 1922 as a fully fledged pedagogy for hundreds of students. So in the core division, there were, let's say in 1924, about 460 students according to the archival data. So it's a lot of students to train, and all of them had to take the course. So in that way, the course was a kind of a true kitchen of architecture, and was both a pedagogical tool for teaching spatial form, but also in itself a laboratory for developing the form. So it was initially nested within the architecture department, and the reason why I'm showing this is just to not confuse you anymore, but to explain that that earlier photo with many faculty sitting at the table. In fact, if we were to look at just one department, the architecture one, we have very different people teaching here that, in fact, did not get along, I think, at all. So we normally would think of Golosov as a constructivist, but he actually really did not like Ginsburg, according to some accounts. And so Ginsburg and Vesnin were in one camp, the constructivist architects. Golosov and Melnikov called themselves academicians, and they were real academicians, Zheltovsky and Shusev. And for those of you who know Soviet architecture, you know what that means. But for us, we're going to focus on the so-called rationalists. And the rationalists were the ones who developed this course space. So the course had sort of two main phases of its evolution. The first one was within the architecture department, and then, as I said, it became its own universal sort of discipline. So this is actually a photo which is taken quite early, in fact, probably around 1922, where it's already clear that there is an incredible pedagogical coherency that we can see here. So this is an exercise on form and structure. And in fact, there was a kind of an incredible already sequence of exercises that was developed by the rationalists that essentially was, every exercise had two parts. So one part was abstract, the other part was applied or production, so exercise. So for example, the exercise on form would result in, actually maybe I can point with this. The exercise on form here would result into a kind of project on a smithy, for example, or an exercise on mass and weight would result in a storage facility, or an exercise on balance and mechanical properties of form would result in a suspended restaurants. So I will go through those in larger scale so you can actually see. So the initial assignment, as I said, was devoid of any practical requirement in order to focus on just the abstract spatial form. And the assignment was free of any constraints. And I think the freedom to suspend such integral elements of architecture, scale, function, or site, allowing the students to avoid the typical tropes of by decoupling conventions and treating the form as strictly abstract. And then once this was complete, then we had an exercise which was implied like this incredible rendering of a, I think it's a facility for like a silo facility. So, and this is that wonderful restaurant. And it's very interesting to follow some of the students. So this is the student, Mikhail Korzhev, who actually has a very kind of long-standing career in architecture, at least as a student. So some of his works are here at the CCA. But the first exercise was on form, like the one that I showed, and that was given in October 20, 1920 by Ladovsky. Here we have his facsimile. And so it asks the students it gives the form, rectangular prism, and asks to articulate that idea of rectangular prism somehow. Its proportion, maybe the way it appears to people. So this idea of perception becomes really, really important. How do we perceive the form? And so I think that's something, it's again an open question, let's discuss it. The other set of assignments are on the articulation of dynamics, rhythm, relations, proportions. And those had two versions. One was horizontal and one was vertical. And in fact, one, in a way, targeted the planners, and the other one targeted architects. So we can now see how this emerged. And this is always really exciting to see. This is the assignment for the tower. So you could see how was it possible to get this kind of results by, in fact, developing this rather simple brief. So the next set of assignments, when the core program becomes sort of school-wide, is going from surface to kind of this frontal space, to spatial form, to volume, and to an exercise of mass and weight. And those in fact are meant to address a whole range of students. So people in textiles, for example, would be taking, would be using the surface exercise in one way, while architects will be thinking of the facade studies, for example. An exercise on the kind of deep space or narrow space would be targeting stage set designers, like this one, or perhaps also future planners, or maybe somebody like Frank Gehry coming out. And depending on the year or instructor, students worked on articulating volumetric form, also from the basic rectangular one to this kind of more dynamic. So one of the things that they were doing here is expressing or exploring the effects of a dynamic force, such as rotation, on various geometries. So the other force that was being explored, of course, is the force of gravity. And in fact, gravity is a really important quality because if we think of modern architecture, it is all about defying gravity. It's all about lightness, and it's all about dynamic forces. So those were exactly the kinds of objectives that the Vkhutemas students were working on. So paradoxically, the pedagogy of space course was to a large extent relied on making solids. And one of the few materials available in the economically devastated post-revolutionary Russia was, of course, clay, the liquid stone. That was, and that I think the choice was in many ways fortuitous. So clay allowed for an immediate interactive process, particularly conducive to freeing up design intuition, because you're working with your hands. You are really learning by doing, in a kind of do-and way. So it focused student attention on pure form rather than materiality. So it's interesting to compare those studies to the material studies at the Bauhaus. Of course, that being said, clay was also used in Germany quite a bit for model making. So students conceived their work in 3 dimensions to begin with, and I think this was really key. This is probably one of the kind of first moments in history where architects just worked in model to begin with, that there was no projectile drawings, no plans and sections. In fact, those things were difficult to do projectile drawings with. In fact, they were, I think, very much ahead of their time. I mean, I keep thinking of the Guggenheim when I look at this, but this is actually, a lot of the photographs that I'm showing are photographs from the collection at the center here. So and you can see some of them up in the exhibition next door. So this is quite exciting, I think, but to see them on the big screen also, right? Because they give a very different sense. And just to let you know, I mean, those were, so some of the examples, there were a number of publications that published this within the school and kind of also following the course, and journals and magazine articles about this. But this one gives you an example of how would an abstract exercise on mass and weight, for example, turn into, let's say, a pavilion like this, right, where the same principles are now applied and become kind of somewhat architectural, and it actually develops further and further in the diploma works. So what were the kind of theories that that sort of made that possible. So Ladovsky didn't write much, but he did have a few texts that were, I think, incredibly articulate in terms, or actually not incredibly articulate, but very clear in a way, or assertive for sure, in terms of describing what what his theory of architecture was. So he outlined that the four qualities of form, geometric, physical, and mechanical, and logical, as fundamental to sort of having to express in model, and those form the theoretical framework for the so-called psychoanalytical method. It's another word for objective method that rationalists use. So this universal properties of form would serve as the elements for the new architectural order. So the idea was that this new modern architecture would also need some kind of order, maybe similar to what classical order was just shortly before. And these qualities then formed the pedagogical basis for the course space and eventually developed also into the corresponding assignments that we were just looking at, the articulation of form, of space, volume, rhythm, structure, balance, and mass, or mass and weight. So Ladovsky was thinking about also the kind of most fundamental needs for what architecture was supposed to do, and this was an idea of orientation and space. And so I want to now go into the kind of the next phase of the presentation, which is the last phase, which we'll talk about what does it orientation and space means, and in general, what does perception in architecture would mean and how that is used for the development of form. So psychotechnical laboratory was established at Vkhutemas in 1927, so quite late in the game. Soviet architects saw science, in this case, the science of psychotechnics, as a basis for reforming architecture from an elitist artistic practice, still then kind of entangled in a myriad of historicized styles into an objective, scientifically grounded field. So this is actually Ladovsky with his colleagues here on the construction of Red Stadium in Moscow. So inspired by the Harvard Experimental Psychological Laboratory, led by German-American scientist Hugo Münsterberg, the Vkhutemas facility was established then at the school, kind of inspired by this set of instruments here. So Ladovsky and his team developed a system for measuring various abilities they deemed fundamental for the future Soviet architects. They specifically tested for attention, memory, accuracy of vision, spatial sensibility, spatial coordination, orientation, imagination, ability in spatial combination, and motor skills. So how did they do that with those incredible tools? So testing at the psychotechnical laboratory at Vkhutemas was conducted with the help of two types of devices, the questionnaire charts and also the instruments that they built. And so there's 5 sets that survived that I'll go through. The simplest one here is called line eye meter or liglazometer, which is essentially questions. So you would have this, if you notice, this kind of division marker, and it will be turned to you, and you'll have to imagine moving this to exactly half or 1/3 of this line. So, and there are no divisions facing you, but there are divisions facing the examiner, so that they would measure your ability to divide in equal increments. So in other words, a kind of ability for perfect accuracy of vision. This one here is uglozometer or angle eye meter. So it has a rotating disc, and you would have to, with a kind of line here, and basically you would have to rotate it to the exact angle, let's say a straight angle or 30 degree or 60 degrees. So again, with sort of the idea that you would need to have this perfect vision to become an architect. Or this one here that would test you in terms of the relationship between the shape and its area. So what appears larger to you? Is the square or the circle? Even though they are the same area, but they appear in different way. And so this actually begins to talk about a larger question that the laboratory was asking. It wasn't only about testing the students to make sure that their eye accuracy was perfect. It was actually also a kind of research laboratory to figure out what in fact appears larger. A square or the circle of the same size, what kind of volume, like in this one, it's a volumiometer, what kind of volume, an inverted cone, a sphere, or whatever this is, another kind of a jar, would appear larger. So if you put a liquid in here, can you tell exactly what size, how much liquid there is in these different objects? Of course, the most I think fascinating one is this one. It's a spaciometer, where I would love to build that at some point, which a little bit like a torture device from medieval times, where you would place different objects on those inclines, and then you will need to sort of measure the depth of field relative to this inclined plane, so it will actually appear differently. And all of those, if you think about it, they are kind of doing a number of things. So they are testing the students. They're also then would be training the students as a result, right? So you would improve your spatial perception by moving that little marker to the point where you could actually tell exactly where the middle of the line is. But also, it will allow for, and I'll actually move forward. Hold on. It will allow to have this other component, which I think was the most exciting one, where they would then sit there in those methodological research cabinets and really spend a lot of time working on the various sort of laws of form, what they called. What were the perfect combinations that would have different effects on a viewer? What was, for example, the relationship between articulation of weight as a function of mass, or the different rhythmic and metric rows. So there are many of those studies. So in many ways, they're kind of almost appear computational or proto-computational. There are also this kind of research was actually lasting the decades. So this is a page from Ginsburg's Rhythm and Architecture book, published in 1923, which in fact just got translated last year in English. So I recommend reading this, and it's actually well written. I mean, he was a great writer. And the textbook written by the rationalists called The Elements of Spatial Composition, which also studied this. So what is that? What is the relevance of all of this to this larger mass kind of education of the masses to the new society? Or why did they do this, right? What was the idea? So the relevance of the experiments of the Harvard lab for the Soviet architects were not limited to scientific exploration of perception and psychophysics, but indeed it was Münsterberg's application of the Taylor ideas that was of interest to the Vkhutemas research. So, of course, Münsterberg was interested in applying his ideas to the principles of scientific management developed by Frederick Winslow Taylor. So, and Taylor and his theories were really fascinating to the Soviet leaders such as Lenin. Of course, he was talking about how we should try every scientific and progressive suggestion of the Taylor system in dismissing superfluous and useless motions and determining the most correct methods of work, the best systems of accounting and control. The Soviet Republic must adopt valuable and scientific technical advance in this field. So Lenin was really a believer in this scientific organization of labor, and there was an Institute of Labor that was set up in Moscow. And that institute, in fact, and we can see some of the examples of sort of similar work that was done at the same time, let's say by Frank and Lilla and Gilbreth, the cyclographs that measured and studied the human movement. And headed by Gustav, the revolutionary poet and leader of proletarian culture movement, the institute established a system of scientifically organized advanced labor practices, and which became one of the main pillars of the centralized planning economy. And it did so by studying those movements and applying them to the work of the factory workers, and then creating this kind of charts like how to work. And I think what's really interesting about the work of the institute, or the research of the institute, was this kind of strange combination between almost the reality and the science, and also the kind of reflection in art, in culture. So biomechanics of Meyerhold that were happening at the same time, I think, continue that same Taylorist techniques in theater, and that's in fact, I think, this idea of optimization of movement and optimization of work and optimization then by sort of extension of form, right, is something what was of interest to the Soviet architects, to the rationalists. So psychotechnical laboratory at Vkhutemas presented a compelling case of adapting this larger social mission to the field of architecture, which conveniently lay outside of the measurable domain of industrial production. It also constituted a case of curious inversion, one which subjects of the study, so students, became the principal agents in defining the object of scientific investigation, namely the form. So by testing the students, they were getting data, right? And because we're talking that there were hundreds of students, there was actually sufficient data, even in the short amount of the time that the laboratory existed. Analyzing the abilities of future architects was simply the first practical task set out by the laboratory. So in the report, I'm reading now the report published by Georgy Krutikov, whose project you saw in the very beginning with the Flying City. So he was planning to take additional steps in the next report. So, and I quote him, "The test produced rich material for evaluating the system and for its improvements." And these were to address questions of architectural form through the test and spatial composition. And this, he speculated, would ultimately lead to defining many general questions of architectural pedagogy. Of course, unfortunately, that did not happen. Now I'm skip through that. So in addition to its purely scientific significance, Ladovsky was concerned with the laboratory's practical application and application for daily architectural operations. So he writes, "How many misunderstandings could be avoided with the help of the laboratory when evaluating the quality of architectural work? Such misunderstandings can be described as the discrepancies between the objective properties of form, registered, let's say, orthogonally, like in plan and section, and the actual perceived properties, so apparent only through your bodily experience." In other words, he was trying to bridge the gap between the kind of normal design process of the architects through planimetric projections and the actual experience on site, and that's what he called orientation. So that's the part where I think was a little bit maybe confusing before. So an architect in Ladovsky's mind had to understand and manage the relationship between the two. While the objective representation of form had traditionally been the object of architectural design and thus usually fixed by two-dimensional representations, perception could only be evaluated in 3 or in 4 dimensions. This is actually one of his first, well, one of his only buildings, the train station in Moscow. And you can see some of the repeating motifs. So I was showing this earlier, and you can see the kind of rhythm and rotation. And here again, we see the rhythm and kind of the movement kind of pulling you in. So think about like this bodily experience. And I'm going to end with this slide here, which is the last page of this newspaper that we've been reading here, Osnova News. It is in this context that one might interpret the poetic slogan on the back of the Osnova News, a paraphrase of Protagoras' famous claim that man is the measure of all things. Instead of an anthropocentric Greek dictum, Soviet architects, the rationalists, believed in the inherent and objective value of what is in front of their eyes. They believe that in the power of gigantic structures like this one. So let me read this kind of poem. Man, which is a translation of what we see here. Man is the measure of all tailors. Grandmothers believed Earth is the center of the world, and man is the measure of all things. They used to say about this, what a giant. And even now they compare this to nothing than extinct animal. Do not compare this to bones or meat. Learn to see what is in front of your eyes. Here is a man, a tailor's measure, but measure architecture with architecture. So I think this is it, and I'd rather maybe open this up to discussion and talk in kind of more conversational manner. So thank you.